that includes 85% of, say, Jharkhand, and maybe 30% of Punjab or Kerala, then so be it. That's the way to look at it. Now, what had happened is that since there's not that data, the tendency has been to forget the principle and then do a pure arithmetic symmetry. And arithmetic symmetry is really a terrifying problem because that looks plausible and yet it's not. Now, since you're all in a university, I was going to make a highbrow remark. One of the Indian epistemologists in 4th, 5th century, Nagarjuna, said he discussed the problem which many Indian epistemologists have discussed, namely confusing a snake for a rope. Sorry, a rope for a snake. Now, he pointed out that it's a learned error. Because if you had no idea what a snake looks like, you would never think of a rope as a snake. If you thought that the snake looked like a hippopotamus, you wouldn't think that a rope is a snake. On the other hand, if you knew something, you could make a mistake. Now, if you know something, if there's some superficial plausibility, then you can fall for an argument saying, okay, with 70-50, why don't we do it egalitarian way? 75% urban Kerala, who are now quite rich. People used to say when we were praising Kerala, we never called it a model, when we were praising Kerala, saying, my God, they will be ruined in terms of income. Well, they have grown faster than the rest of India by a dramatic amount, and so has Himachal, and so has Tamil Nadu, all the states we're trying to praise. So these states are now among the richer states, particularly Kerala and Tamil Nadu, to some extent Punjab, of course. Now, and here I'm being anti-Kerala. I don't think Kerala could be demanding 75% of the Kerala population being covered, because 75% of the poor Indians, if you looked at that, the Kerala share of that isn't 75% of the population, is way below that, because they have been successful in their way of dealing with their problem. They're among the ones who have followed the Asian development path more fully than the rest of India has. And it is a very major division. But one result of it is that if we are trying to do it equitably today, then we have to do something which approximates to the principle of 75% poorest Indian in urban areas, 50% in, rural areas, 50% in urban areas. Now, then you have to go into the realm of approximation if you don't have all the data. Then by looking at per capita income of the state, you can arrive at some kind of a formula, but it isn't going to be the same. And if anyone thinks there's a symmetry there, well, it's a symmetry that's a completely bogus symmetry for the purpose for which we are considering the entire food security bill. So that's enormously important to recognize. Now, if that was what and where, then comes the question of who. This was the subject it came up. Now here, I must say I've been working on capability for a long time, and James Heckman's work, indeed his Nobel Prize also, wasn't on this kind of thing. He was working on something quite different. But recently he's been working on the impact on child deprivation in terms of capabilities for the future. And the results are quite startling. Now, oddity is that China has done much, much better in terms of child undernourishment than India had. But nevertheless, goaded by Jim Heckman and me, CDRF, China Development Research Fund, decided that they ought to do something, namely begin a child feeding program of a kind that they didn't actually have. Their success was based on much larger wage growth and so on, which I'm not discussing. The Chinese growth rates have grown about 7 times faster than the Indian wage rate, and that makes a big difference. But on the other hand, they were sufficiently worried about this problem, and they wanted to know whether there are examples where the ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, has worked or not. And we have that, and we have a chapter on that in the book. It worked very well in some states like Tamil Nadu, and it's not worked very well at other places, but even there hardly any state where it's not worked at all. So it's really, but there's a much bigger waste proportion. So the Chinese were encouraged by the Tamil experience and wanted to emulate that, to supplement already better record than they had in order to fill up the gaps. Now that's what I would consider to be a use of reasoning, and it's to our shame coming in a country which is not a multi-party democracy, but which encourages public reasoning for public policy. Now, we could do the same if the political parties would pay attention to the main issues that ail India today. And for that we need information. We need to proceed in a way that respects information. When Montek and I were together in an earlier meeting arranged by NDTV, I quoted a book which I quite like, but I think the title is better than the book, Lionel Trilling's book, called The Moral Obligation to be Intelligent. Now, it's not that difficult to be intelligent because you feel morally obliged to be. And if you're not sufficiently intelligent, you may not even figure out what is being said, what is being asked of you. On the other hand, moral obligation to be informed, I think that's really important. It's important to recognize that when Ambedkar was expressing suspicion that the Constitution, even though good, in which he had a major role, may not guarantee social justice, he thought the way to do it is to supplement by what? Educate, organize, and agitate. But educated was step one. We need that. Now, with that, I think we could see that the impact that was being proposed could be really quite disastrous on the basis of the evidence that we already have, namely what have been the impact of ICDS on child development, as well as international information like the one from Heckman's studies. So I think if you take that into account, then we get a kind of gradation. There was certain thing that was guaranteed in principle by the ICDS and asked for in principle by the Supreme Court. Now that stands at a certain level. The next step is that the bill seemed to have watered that down a certain amount, even though I welcome it, because you won't get everything you ask for, and it was going in that direction, but we have to note that it's a weakening. Then came the further weakening, that in the state level of the standing committee, it got further weakened. And in fact, the entitlement of the children got removed, the very small children. Instead of that, we had 5 kilograms of rice for pregnant women. Now, they need that. On the other hand, you have removed something which is known to have a major impact on capability formation of human beings. I think this question of what do we understand to be development is really critically important here, because if by development you just by, for the moment, short-run growth rate, and not even whether it's gone up or not, then I think you can arrive at enormously different conclusions. Now, I admire quite a lot of things that's happened in Gujarat. For example, the development of physical infrastructure. There's a real lesson to be learned. But to say that he's having a high growth rate and therefore it's the best performing Indian state, which seems to have been the way it was greeted in a discussion in this city, it seems a bit mistaken. A, because it's not much higher than before. B, because Maharashtra is going almost as fast, 0.1% different, 8.1, 8.2 as Gujarat. C, because there are states like Uttarakhand which is going faster. D, because if you divide it not by decades, by 5 years, Bihar has raised their growth rates from 2% to 10% compared with last 5 years in the light of the preceding 5 years. Whereas in Gujarat, it hasn't moved at all. But I think most importantly, the long-run sustenance of the growth depends on what I believe is the Asian strategy of economic development. It isn't that that strategy was unknown in India. In fact, Bohre committee at the time of the Constitution, 46, just discussed that we have to recognize that economic performance depends on healthy kids and depends on their education, depends on their being disease-free. So that was an immediate nod to the Asian direction. And long before the Asian direction emerged fully, other than in Japan, in the early years of the century, when Jamshedji Tata was setting up Jamshedpur, he noted the fact that there was help coming from Curzon and the British government with physical infrastructure, rather in the same way in Gujarat, that is road and so on. In this case, particularly railways, which the Tatars wanted. What was neglected was health and education. So the first thing that Jamshedji had to do was to say that I have to treat it not just as an industry, but also as a municipality, providing free education for all and free health care for all. So that is the way to increase industrial production and make it an economic success. Now that is a lesson of more than 100 years ago, which we have reason to stick to, and it's been vindicated since then. That was very early days by what happened in China, in Korea, in Taiwan, and Thailand, and even to some extent Indonesia, and happening in Vietnam. Not to mention other places now, increasingly. Brazil is a good case, even though their growth rate right now this year has fallen. I would imagine that, I would predict that their long-term growth rate will be as high as it had been, excepting this year they are down as their ups and downs. So I think we have to really integrate the fact that we know something about human capability formation. It does depend on the care with which children are fed and educated. Not just that, also adults too, and as Montague said, also mothers, how they are fed. I'm not going to comment on breastfeeding, since I don't have a vast experience on that subject, but I would say that the maternal undernourishment is certainly a major factor in that. On that I have written. So I think that we have to take a broad-based view about how to form human capability for the sake of social justice and well-being, but even for the sake of growth and development. People keep saying that, isn't it depressing that the growth rate has come down? Well, you have to see that, did you expect that growth rate to be sustained? India was expecting a nearly as high growth rate as China, with 1/3 of the population close to illiteracy, with half the households not having toilet, 1/3 of the people not having electricity connection, 40% of the children undernourished, minimally estimated. I mean, that's a pretty hard thing to expect that would happen if there's anything in the Asian economic development, anything on all those discussions. I strongly recommend, since you're in the university, the discussion about the code of education in Japan in 1860s after the Meiji Restoration, as to how to bring about high growth and development. As the Code of Education, the motivational paper said that the Japanese people are just as smart as American, excepting we don't have the education, we don't have the health care. And I think that was an insight from 1860s, which was not lost on the pioneering development people like Jamshedji, and which have somehow deserted us. And now we have suddenly this debate, are you in favor? If you say anything about feeding kids, you're told you're anti-growth. But this is absolutely ridiculous, because and that's only half the point, that growth isn't ultimately your objective, because ultimately it's human life. But secondly, even growth as an objective, there is a part to be played by human capability formation. It assumes as if last 40 years, all the economic literature on it has had nothing to inform us. It's a kind of, this idea, also I often hear tremendous praise about China's high growth rate. We should pursue it. and concentrate on growth, and like the Chinese. Now this is kind of very odd because that's not what the Chinese have done. They spend 2.7% of GDP on public health, government health care. We spend 1.2%. We have a delivery problem too, which they don't have, but they do address it. We ought to address it more simultaneously. So I think the idea of just recommending China with the foggiest of idea of what the Chinese actually do is really not a good way for learning from the rest of the world. So I come back now to two final points because I'm taking a lot of your time. One is the financial fiscal problem, and I think Montek has addressed that question very well. We spend about 70,000 crores, I think, about in food subsidies now. That's less than the diesel subsidy, isn't that right? 90,000 or so already. And you know, and diesel, most Indians don't have an instrument into which diesel can go in. Similarly, when the people are worried about sudden power failure, well, 1/3 of the Indians didn't have any electricity connection at all. Cooking gas is an important issue for many. I'm not denying that. These are all important issues for us. But in terms of the poorest of the poor, in terms of, and that's a huge number in India, more than half the people, you're dealing with, when you define the ordinary people of Aam Aadmi as the relatively poor of the rich in the country, then you get a very distorted politics. Then you are arguing on behalf of the ordinary people, things that ordinary people as the majority have no use for, like a cooking gas to put into a cylinder to be put into a cooker that they don't have, and so on. And similarly, diesel subsidy, similarly, fertilizer subsidy, and lots of things. Fertilizer subsidy, raise agricultural productivity. But we have to say at what cost? What is its impact on distribution? So I take the view that the fiscal issue is seriously, wrongly discussed. And what is really important is the point with which I began, namely that, and because of Ritika kindly referring to the fact that I had spoken about it in Bombay, in the Bombay IIT, as it happened, or your sister institution in Bombay, or Mumbai. I'm sorry, I'm very hesitant to call it Mumbai still. I don't like it. A very prejudiced Bengali friend of mine, Salma Sawan, alas dead, a Bangladeshi friend, told me once that don't be very critical, don't be very harsh on people from Bombay for changing their name to Mumbai, because you have to bear in mind that Mumbai is quite a decent effort if you're trying to say Bombay while looking for your denture. Now, I think that's a very unkind Bengali remark. And I didn't say it, I just quoted it. But so in the Mumbai IIT, I did discuss that. And the fact is that children under 3 isn't an organized group. Diesel users are, fertilizer users are, LPG users are. Those who want to keep electricity tariff low, that's kind of implicit subsidy, because if you are having losses and the state or the state government or the central government, one way or another, is meeting that, well, that is subsidy in effect. So we have to look at the fiscal problem, and I quite agree with Monte that the fiscal problem is not fully understood. So how question isn't really what it looks like. I was very fortunate because Monte chairing it, I aired myself in the Indian Economic Association, which many years ago, about 35 years before him, I was president of, actually, and he was president, and he asked me, and I used the occasion to complain about certain things, including the fact that the loss of revenue by not having import duty on gold and diamond, even taking into account that some of it would be re-exported, is much greater than what was being proposed at that time as additional cost for food security at that time. This was the beginning of 2012. It came in that budget. But it was, of course, such a strongly opposed by the quote-unquote Aam Aadmi of the relatively poor among the rich, or actually even the very rich as well, in terms of jewelry and gold cost, that the government had to give up. But that is, the fact that it gave up is not surprising. Democracy is like that. If we want our democracies to succeed, then we have to put the agenda that really matter to us in front, insist that the political parties come online, even if they're not online already, as they should be, on grounds of what their general philosophy might be. At least some of the parties should be. Given that, I think there is a real role not only for reasoning, which I've been singing in praise of, but also of understanding and then determination and a commitment to put the major issues that Indians face in front of us. Now, as an Indian citizen, and despite teaching in various universities, I remained an exclusively Indian citizen. That's exactly what I think we want. So I think you and I can join on that. I've already done my bit a little bit. You can do a little bit too. And I'm delighted, therefore, that all of you are here, because it is a subject where not only reasoning is important, but people listening to you, people arguing with you, people discussing it, and if there's something convincing in it, demanding it, could make a real difference to the nature of the country, which is in a sadder state than it need be. And with that hope, as an Indian citizen, I appeal to you to think about these issues, and hopefully we can arrive at something on which we agree. Thank you.
I thought that since we have an extra hour from him, there'll also be lots of time for questions, but I believe 4 o'clock is when he has to go. So maybe we'll take 1 or 2 questions. Please stick to this, to the topic. Please don't ask him about going to the moon or, you know. Yes. A brief question on the topic, which is hunger and nutrition, and please try to be brief. There are some people here. If you raise your hands, then they might be able to see you.
Yes, sir. I am very much attracted by your speech, sir. My name is Umesh Prasad Singh. My alma mater is Calcutta University. After listening to you with rapt attention, sir, my question to you is just in the form of quest that I'm reminded of Milton Sampson's Agonistes when you were speaking of John Stuart Mill with respect to equality re-examined, sir, you have written that needs to be a little bit clarified, because in our country, the equality is a great problem, and in terms of equality, we have not re-examined properly, and that's, sir, just elucidate that, as you have mentioned during the course of your lectures.
Okay, should I take another question and then maybe you can, yeah? Was there someone here? Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Anshul Gupta, and my question is, the food security bill comes again with targeting of specific sectors, specific people, maybe 46% and 28%, which we have come up. So again, there's a problem in the targeting which we have seen, leading to corruption, lack of transparency and accountability. So my question is, not that a universal PDS system will be better instead of the targeting one?
Thank you.
I think these are both very good questions. The first one, I'm very pleased you asked the question, if only because it may encourage people to read my book. But the title is not Equality Re-examined, it's Inequality Re-examined. So there wasn't any claim that there was any equality already. And secondly, so it's not a question of re-examining what equality India has achieved. I never claim it has achieved any. Secondly, it wasn't a comment on a country, it was a comment on theory as to the literature of inequality in which I participated, and among the more quoted authors are Tony Atkinson and Anthony Shorrock and myself as well, I was criticizing the way we had formulated it. It was a pure theory discussion. So what I discussed today, and John Stuart Mill thing, and I'm delighted you referred to the government by discussion. The discussion would be, how would you actually apply that kind of reasoning, re-examined inequality analysis to India? Well, what the book did was to argue in favor of looking at inequality of capabilities, how it can be done, why it's important, what its implications would be. And that's what my talk was about. So I'm absolutely delighted you asked the question. There's an immediate link between that book and this. I don't strongly recommend people to read it unless you like mathematical reasoning, because the book is pretty mathematical, and there's a lot of it which can be discussed without that much mathematics. At least you could read the non-mathematical chapters. On the second issue, the targeting versus universal, it's a really big issue. The universal, you're quite right, the universal coverage, you refer to one advantage, but there are two. One advantage is that it reduces corruption, certainly true, because everyone is covered. You don't have to pretend. Secondly, that's another advantage. That is, when you have a universal coverage, actually there are three points. When there's a universal coverage, you include among the people who get benefit from it, very powerful people as well. So that if someone wants to abolish it, the protest comes from people, not just the bottom of the pile who have relatively little political strength, but those who have more political muscle. The person who makes that point most powerfully is Tony Judd, that J-U-D-T, whose writings I do recommend, and where he discusses why that's very important. There's a third point, which is quite important, and I think has been somehow lost in the Anglo-American debate, but it's quite big in the non-English-speaking European countries. Namely, universalism is a different way of looking at it. It's not a distributional attempt only. It is a right of a citizen. And there is something to be, I think it's a very important thing to think about. So to just, for example, we have now facing the problem in case of Nalanda University, with which I'm chair of the board, I happen to be chancellor. We are trying to set up the Nalanda University. We expect that teaching in a small way will begin next year, 2014 fall. The question of fees come up. Now, there are many universities which charge relatively little fee, and IIT may not be one of them. I don't know enough about IIT, but Delhi University, for example, doesn't charge very much. Now, the argument, are these relatively better off? Yes, they would be, quote unquote, arm admi in the narrow sense. So on inequality ground, yes, you ought to charge them. But there are two difficulties, and here I knew it not in my present role as Chancellor of Nalanda University, but as my past role as the head of an English college, namely Trinity. There's a huge difference between people who had to take an enormous amount of loan in order to begin, in order to do their education. So they begin their professional life with this burden, which immediately excludes them certain kind of work, like pro bono work, low salary work. On the other hand, the rich remain free. Now this generates a power relation which I think is not altogether a positive one. So I think at Nalanda we haven't solved that problem. We are discussing what would be the right approach. There is an equality-based consideration, income inequality in particular. There is a mobility-based consideration, and there's also a question of freedom-based consideration of the relatively poor kids compared with the relatively rich. But like in all these cases, just as Montague emphasized, there are multiple causes for many things. There are multiple arguments in different directions. You have to balance this. And I don't think you should take the view, I don't think you are taking it, you're asking a question, that universalism is always better. There are many cases it is better. Targeting can be sometimes better. In terms of certain types of welfare expenditure, I think Tamil Nadu, for example, by having universalism, has done a lot better even in terms of expenses, than others have. Those which are narrowly targeted. There's something to discuss here.
Yeah, in fact, you have a paper in which you say benefits for the poor end up being poor benefits. I don't know if you remember it.
That's the Tony. Yeah, I didn't. Actually, I think I said it before, Tony. But
Yeah, I think that's true. And the last time I reminded you also, you had forgotten that this is your own paper. Can I ask Umakant to ask
actually,
a
I
question?
have to tell you a story. There's also me a paragraph, and saying, "What do you think of that?" I thought he had just written. I said it's absolutely brilliant. He said, "Yeah, I thought you would say so. You wrote it."
Well, so thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. But
Where
my,
are you?
my I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
My question is addressed actually to both the panelists.
Yeah.
This is regarding the food subsidy that it goes very high if we implement a food security bill kind of thing. But if I'm not an economist, so I do not know what is the validity of the corporate income tax, which is being waived off every year in the annual budget, is almost close to 0.7 or 0.8% of the GDP. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So one of the apprehension was in the Standing Committee of Parliament also that the food subsidy will cross even 1% of the GDP, which we are not in a position to provide. So if we can have almost 1% of GDP going into waiving of corporate income tax, which I do not understand why should we have in the first place itself. Why can't we have enough money to feed the poor people and hungry people? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what aspect of the corporate income tax you were really referring to. But you know, the costing, as I think I said that, I don't think it will be difficult to fit the food subsidy requirement into the budget constraint. Something else will have to give. Now, whether the government wants to get rid of some other subsidy or cut some other expenditure or raise some more taxes, it can be left to the government and the finance ministry. The limited point I think I was making, and I think Professor Sen also agrees, the money that's involved in the food subsidy can very easily be treated as a high priority first choice, and it should not get linked to the budget deficit. I mean, we should, in my view, control the budget deficit. But you know, as I mentioned, I don't know if I gave the figures, but you know, even if the food subsidy comes to 100,000 crores or something like that, I mean, the diesel subsidy is 91,000 crores. And there is no merit to subsidizing diesel. So there are many things the government can do. I'm not saying what they should do, but I don't believe the government or anyone else should say that we can't afford the food subsidy because of the fiscal deficit. That would be actually dishonest. It's a separate issue if you say, well, look, we're going to spend this money, now how do we do it most effectively? And that's a debate that goes on.
I think there are some.
I will have to go soon, though.
Okay, last question.